Hello and welcome to Wednesday Wandering with me, Cate Field, wondering about things creative and spiritual and quietly fascinating and not just wandering off. If you are new here, a very warm welcome to you. I share art tutorials every Monday and Friday and this little gentle wandering every Wednesday. A few moments to pause, to reflect, and perhaps to see how art and faith and the creative life help us to make sense of this world. There is something about mid-November, about the light, here in my little bit of southwest England in Dorset. It's thin but tender, and that makes us more aware of one another's humanity, I think. The days are drawing in and the air is turning metallic with cold, and the earth seems to pause between seasons. And at this time, two commemorations meet. We have the feast of St. Martin of Tours and Remembrance Day, and both speak of compassion and both of courage offered quietly. Later, I will tell you the story of my great-grandfather. But first, imagine the bitter chill of a European winter night. The kind that seeps into your bones and steals your breath. A soldier rides through that darkness, cloaked, wrapped tight against the wind. Ahead, a man sits by the roadside, shaking, trembling with cold. Martin doesn't offer him charity in the abstract. He stops. He cuts his heavy military cloak in two. It wasn't a perfect gift. The cloak was rough and thick with use, and perhaps a bit smelly, of horses and sweat, but it was warm and serviceable and real, half given, half retained. And that simple act of imperfect but practical compassion became a story that outlived empires. It wasn't grandeur, it was survival shared. The fragment of cloth was later treasured as a relic and kept in a small building built for its safekeeping, a capella, a chapel. And out of that half-cloak grew a word and a world of sheltering spaces. From one act of mercy, the tradition of sanctuary comes. And our main source for Martin's life is the Vita Sancti Martini, the life of St. Martin, written around 397, by Sulpicius Severus, a Roman nobleman who turned monk, who was Martin's contemporary and admirer, and it's one of the earliest Christian biographies written after the Gospels, and it shaped the entire tradition of hagiography that followed. So Martin was born in Sabaria, in modern Szombathely in Hungary, around 316. And the son of a pagan Roman officer raised in northern Italy, he was conscripted into the imperial cavalry at 15, and hence the setting of the famous cloak story, which takes place while he was stationed in Amiens in northern Gaul, which is now in France. So according to Sulpicius, on a freezing winter day, Martin encountered a beggar shivering by the city gates, and moved by compassion, he cut his military cloak, the chalmis, into with his sword, and he shared it. And that night, Christ appeared to him in a dream wearing the half cloak and saying to the angels, Martin, though still a catechumen, has clothed me with this garment. And this moment led to his baptism soon afterwards. The hinge between soldiering and sainthood is quite interesting, isn't it? And it's notable that Martin's act is not described as miraculous. It's described as practical and human. And that detail, the half-cloak, became his enduring symbol. The relic of the cloak itself was later kept by the Frankish kings. The priest charged with its care was called a capellanus. I think that's how you pronounce it. Capellanus? From which we derive the English words chaplain and chapel. I know that bit, just not sure of the pronunciation. Might have to go back to that. Anyway, Martin left military service and became a disciple of Hilary of Poitiers, one of the great theologians of 4th century Gaul. And he founded what is often called the first monastery in the West at Liguiges near Poitiers, and later another at Marmoutier. My pronunciation is being tested today. This became the centre of missionary activity. The elected Bishop of Tours in 371, he continued to live austerely, reluctant to abandon the simplicity of his monkish life, but he travelled throughout the countryside preaching and healing and challenging the remnants of pagan worship at the time, but not with force, but with gentle persuasion and example. And his pastoral style was marked by humility. He famously opposed the execution of the heretic Priscillian, pleading for mercy before the emperor. He died in 397 AD in Caen Saint Martin and was buried at Tours, where his tomb became a major pilgrimage site. The cult of St. Martin, cult's the wrong word, spread rapidly through medieval Europe. Over 4,000 churches were eventually dedicated to him, and his feast day is the 11th of November, which was yesterday, and this coincided with the agricultural year and the beginning of winter. And this was celebrated with processions, shared feasts, and act of charity. An echo of his gesture with the cloak. You can imagine this, can't we? In England, Martinmas became a day for slaughtering the last animals before winter and sharing meat with the poor. St. Martin embodies a particular kind of holiness, not the heroism of martyrdom, but the sanctity of compassion and practicality. And his story stands at the meeting point of military and monastic life, of power and humility, action and contemplation. The Vita presents him as both visionary and realist, a man whose miracles arise from empathy rather than from spectacle. And that blend of inner conviction and outward service seems to align really quite beautifully with this theme of practical kindness and creative mending. And when I think of creative acts that mend, my mind wanders to Louise Bourgeois. Her work moves between the domestic and the monumental, between needle and steel. And she said that sewing was an act of emotional repair, and I know what she means in that. In her later years, she stitched together fragments of old clothing, dresses and sheets and table linens, remnants of family life that had absorbed years of touch and memory, and she turned them into sculptures that resemble hearts and limbs or protective cocoons. The fabrics are tenderly worn, their colours faded by lots and lots of washing and light, and they speak of vulnerability and endurance, of care repeated patiently by hand. Each stitch becomes like a small defiance against forgetting, a way of keeping love intact through the work of repair. But Louise Bourgeois was not confined to smallness. In 1999, I stood beneath her towering sculpture Maman when the Turbine Hall at Tate Modern in London opened its doors for the very first time, which was really exciting. And I remember that moment vividly. The hush of people craning towards the extraordinary grace of Maman, which is an immense bronze spider poised on slender legs, which sounds horrific, doesn't it? But beneath the body of the spider hangs a sack of marble eggs. And it really should have been terrifying, but it wasn't. It's protective, maternal. And Bourgeois described the spider as a symbol of her mother, not as a horror, but as a weaver and restorer of tapestries, deliberate, clever, patient, soothing. And standing there, I realised that her spiders and her stitched fabrics were part of the same language, and both spoke of mending. So one with the thread and the fabrics, and one with steel. and both were acts of love and vigilance, guardians of fragility. Now, in 2025, Maman returned to London, and again, I went to see this with my son Tom, and it is quite extraordinary, an incredible piece of artwork. And in Bourgeois' world, repair is never sentimental. Tom's quite sentimental, but that's not what I'm talking about. Bourgeois sews fabric and spins this sort of web of metal, and she shows that care can be both gentle and immense, and that protection, like kindness, can stand tall. Next, I'd like to wonder about Alma Thomas, whose art feels like standing in sunlight after long shadows. I've spoken about her before, but there's always so much more to explore, isn't there? She was 80 years old when she gained national recognition, the first black woman to have a solo exhibition at the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the first African-American woman represented in the White House collection. Again, extraordinary. But for most of her life, she worked quietly as a school teacher in Washington, DC, nurturing creativity in others while painting in the evenings and at the weekends. Her path was anything but easy. She lived through segregation, through the Great Depression and the civil rights struggles of the 1960s. She had chronic arthritis, and this often made it painful even to hold a brush. And yet she chose joy. She said, "Through colour, I have sought to concentrate on beauty and joy. I never married, I paint." Her paintings are symphonies of small hand-painted marks, radiant mosaics of red, blue and yellow and white. And they seem to pulse with light. And when you stand before one, it doesn't really feel like looking at paint. It looks more like energy. It's quite extraordinary. Works such as Resurrection or Wind, Sunshine and Flowers, they shimmer like stained glass. Each brushstroke is distinct, but part of a greater harmony, like notes in this song of resilience. Alma Thomas once explained that her patterns were inspired by the view from her window, the sort of sunlight filtering through trees or the shifting rhythm of petals in the garden. And in that ordinary daily act of looking and noticing, she found renewal, and her art became a way of insisting that beauty still exists and that you can find it. And for me, her determination to paint beauty was both defiant and a gift, a decision to offer warmth to a world that had not always been kind. Her canvases radiate what I think of as creative generosity, light shared freely with no demand in return. Like St. Martin's cloak, her art offers shelter, not from the cold of the weather, but from the coldness of despair. It reminds us that joy, too, can be a form of courage. In these two artists, Louise Bourgeois mending what is torn and Alma Thomas bathing the world in light, we see the same impulse that moved St. Martin on that freezing night. The desire to make wholeness where there is fracture, to offer warmth where there's cold. As you know, I really do like a metaphor. It helps me to make sense of the world. Their materials could not be more different: threadbare linen, bronze, oil and radiant colour. And yet each becomes a vessel for care. Both teach us that creativity is not about perfection, but about participation. I say that a lot. It's about entering the cycle of giving, repairing and renewing. As November deepens and the year leans towards its quiet end, we might ask ourselves what it means to mend and to share warmth in our own lives, not only with our hands, but within our hearts, our attention and our art. Now, finally, I'd like to leave you with a story about my great-grandfather, Frederick Augustus Aberley, who died in the Battle of the Somme. and whose grave is in the magnificent memorial at Cate Field in northern France. He was my grandmother's father. She never knew him as he died before she was born, and for years she was told that he'd been blown to pieces on the battlefield. And that was that. No one talked about it because they just didn't in those days. But it wasn't true. About 20 years ago, my parents decided to take a trip to the battlegrounds of northern France. They've always loved history, and knowing that Mum's granddad had died in the battle, they thought it would be fitting to pay their respects. They stayed in a little guest house near Albert, run by two historians from England. And over breakfast, my parents explained why they were there. And one of the historians said that he could find out a little bit more about Frederick Augustus. And yes, there he was, listed as dying on the 23rd of October, 1916, and his name is recorded at Cate Field Memorial. So off they went to this incredible memorial, high on the hill overlooking the plains. The names of more than 72,000 are engraved on the white stone. But they couldn't find Frederick's name. And Mum asked one of the guides, and her answer was astounding. Frederick's name wasn't listed on the great walls of stone because he had a grave. And that meant he hadn't been blown to pieces on the battlefield, but had been mortally injured and taken back to the hospital where he later died. So they were able to bury his body knowing who he was. My mum was in tears when she called me, telling me the news. And the following year, I made my own pilgrimage, and we go there regularly. In 2009, I took a group of students on a history tour. I used to teach history as well as art. And one of my students laid a flower on my great-grandfather's grave. And she said, really thoughtfully, for 80 years, kind people have looked after his grave, waiting for the time when his family would find him. Oh my goodness. Like I say, we return every couple of years, not to just visit Frederick's grave, but the many others. My husband found the graves of his two great uncles, one whose name is engraved on the incredible Vimy Ridge, that amazing memorial for Canadian soldiers who gave their lives for freedom. Stories like this remind us that remembrance is not only about loss, but about connection. The way love endures through generations, and how acts of care, even those performed long after death, continue to mend what war and time have torn apart. And when I stand among the graves at Cate Field or at Vimy Ridge or the many other graveyards, I often think of St. Martin and his half-cloak, a gesture of warmth offered to a stranger. My great-grandfather's grave, tended all these years by people who never knew him, feels like a similar gesture repeated across time. The kindness of strangers, the sheltering of memory, the will to keep someone warm. Perhaps that is what remembrance truly means. The quiet promise to keep caring, to keep the light, to keep it burning, to hold the world together with small acts of compassion. So as the week draws to a close, may you find warmth in your own remembering. Perhaps mend something that is broken. Offer kindness wherever you can. And know that, like St. Martin's cloak, your gestures of care, however small, will ripple outwards, warming lives you may never meet. Next week, we'll move to another hearth of kindness and the story of St. Margaret of Scotland and the creative beauty of the everyday. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.